The formation was already 200 miles from the carrier when his engine began to falter. Standard doctrine said push forward, stay with your wingman, complete the mission. But Lieutenant Commander John Thatch turned back alone, nursing a dying engine across empty ocean. His squadron mates watched him peel away and disappear into the Pacific haze. Some thought he'd made the safe choice. Others called it something worse. 3 hours later, 7 Japanese fighters found him over open water with nowhere to hide and no one coming to help. What happened next would change how every American pilot fought for the rest of the war. June 1942. The Pacific Ocean stretched endless and indifferent beneath the American carrier task forces steaming toward a cluster of islands most Americans had never heard of. Midway, a dot of coral and sand that Japanese strategists believed would draw out what remained of the United States Navy for destruction. Admiral Yamamoto had assembled the most powerful fleet Japan had ever sent to sea. 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of aircraft, the cream of Japanese naval aviation, pilots who had struck Pearl Harbor, who had swept through the Philippines, who had humiliated the British at Ceylon. They were coming to finish what they started 6 months earlier. Aboard USS Yorktown, USS Enterprise, and USS Hornet, American pilots prepared for a battle they knew might be their last. The odds were not in their favor. Japanese Zero fighters outclimbed, outturned, and outran every American fighter in the Pacific. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat was slower, heavier, less agile. In the months since Pearl Harbor, American fighter pilots had learned this through bitter experience. They had watched friends spiral into the sea, outmaneuvered by pilots who seemed to know exactly where to be and when. The kill ratios were grim. For every Zero shot down, multiple Wildcats fell. The morning air carried the salt-thick humidity of the Central Pacific. Flight crews moved across wooden decks, slick with condensation and aviation fuel. Engines coughed to life in the pre-dawn darkness. Propeller wash rippled across canvas flight suits. In ready rooms below deck, pilots studied charts marked with estimated Japanese positions, ranges calculated from fragmentary intelligence, fuel margins that left almost nothing for error. This was the desperate mathematics of carrier warfare in 1942. Every mission was a calculation of distance, fuel, ammunition, and luck. Pilots knew they might not make it back. Some wouldn't. The Pacific was vast and unforgiving. A ditched aircraft meant hours in the water if rescue came at all. Sharks patrolled these latitudes. So did Japanese submarines. Death came in many forms out here, and none of them were quick. Among the pilots preparing that morning was a man who had spent the previous year obsessing over a problem everyone else accepted as unsolvable. The Zero was simply better. That was the consensus. American pilots would have to wait for better aircraft, better training, or better luck. But this man refused to accept it. He had watched too many good pilots die, using tactics that didn't work against an enemy that seemed to anticipate every move. The solution he carried in his head that morning had been dismissed, doubted, and largely ignored by the naval aviation establishment. It violated the individual combat instincts that most fighter pilots held sacred. It required trust in a wingman at levels that seemed almost irrational. And it had never been tested against actual Japanese fighters in actual combat. In a few hours it would be. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. John Smith Thatch grew up in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, far from any ocean, in a family that valued education and discipline in equal measure. His father was a lawyer who expected his sons to think precisely and argue logically. Young John absorbed these lessons early. He learned to break problems into components, to question assumptions, to distrust easy answers. He entered the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis in 1923, part of a generation that would inherit a Navy still finding its identity between battleship tradition and aviation revolution. Thatch was not the most naturally gifted athlete in his class, nor the most socially connected, but he possessed something that would prove more valuable in the years ahead: an inability to accept failure without understanding its cause. After graduation and surface fleet assignments, Thatch requested aviation training. He earned his wings in 1930 and entered a Navy air arm that was still largely experimental. Carrier doctrine remained, unsettled. Fighter tactics borrowed heavily from World War I dogfighting principles: get on the enemy's tail, stay there, shoot him down. Individual skill and audacity determined outcomes. The best pilots were the best stick-and-rudder artists, the ones who could outmaneuver any opponent through reflexes and aggression. Thatch proved competent in this world, but never exceptional. He was a solid pilot, respected for his judgment and analytical mind rather than his aerial virtuosity. He rose through the ranks steadily, commanding fighter squadrons, teaching younger pilots, absorbing everything he could about aerial combat theory. By 1940, he commanded Fighting Squadron 3, flying Grumman F-3F biplanes off the carrier Saratoga. These were the last of the old generation, fabric-covered and open cockpit, soon to be replaced by the all-metal Wildcats then entering service. Thatch watched the transition with the eye of a tactician. New aircraft meant new capabilities. New capabilities demanded new tactics. He had a wife, Madeline, and young children. The domestic routines of peacetime Navy life filled his hours when he wasn't flying or planning. Weekend barbecues, church on Sundays, the rhythms of a military family awaiting orders that would determine where they lived next. But underneath the surface normalcy, Thatch was already thinking about a war that hadn't started yet. Reports filtered back from observers watching the conflicts in China and Europe. The Japanese were fielding fighters that seemed impossibly capable. German pilots were developing formation tactics that amplified individual skill through coordination. The old dogfighting rules were evolving, and Thatch suspected American doctrine hadn't kept pace. He began reading everything he could find: tactical reports from the Flying Tigers, British accounts from the Battle of Britain, technical intelligence on foreign aircraft performance. He collected data points the way his father had collected legal precedents, building a case in his mind for something he couldn't quite articulate yet. What he found troubled him deeply. The aircraft American fighter pilots would take to war were not superior to their potential adversaries. In some critical measures, they were inferior, and the tactics American pilots trained for assumed a level of individual aircraft performance that simply didn't exist. The question that began forming in his mind would consume him for the next 2 years. If you cannot outfly the enemy airplane, how do you outfight the enemy pilot? The reports from China arrived in fragments throughout 1941, each one confirming Thatch's worst fears. American volunteer pilots flying for the Chinese Air Force were encountering Japanese fighters that defied everything they knew about aircraft design. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was fast, maneuverable, and lethal. It could climb faster than any American fighter. It could turn tighter. It could stay in the air longer on its internal fuel. Against the Brewster Buffalo and early export models American advisors had seen, the Zero was devastating. Pilots who tried to dogfight it on its terms died. The few who survived reported a sickening realization: standard tactics didn't work. You couldn't get on a Zero's tail because it could turn inside you before you completed the maneuver. You couldn't outclimb it because it would be waiting above when your engine ran out of breath. Thatch studied these reports with the methodical intensity he applied to everything. He didn't dismiss them as exaggeration or excuse-making, as some in the naval aviation community did. He took them seriously. He spread performance estimates across his desk and began mapping the geometry of impossible combat. The F-4F Wildcat his squadron would fly was heavier than the Zero. It had armor plating to protect the pilot. It had self-sealing fuel tanks that reduced the risk of fire. These features added weight, and weight stole performance. The Wildcat was tougher but slower. It could absorb punishment that would destroy a Zero, but it couldn't avoid getting hit in the first place. Traditional fighter doctrine said to engage in turning fights, get behind the enemy, match his maneuvers, stay in the killing position until you had a shot. This worked when aircraft were roughly equal. It was suicide against a superior opponent. Thatch began playing with matchsticks on his kitchen table, moving them in patterns that represented aircraft in three-dimensional space. His wife watched him push the little wooden sticks around for hours, muttering to himself, occasionally sweeping them aside in frustration and starting over. The problem seemed insoluble. If you couldn't turn with the enemy, you couldn't fight him. If you couldn't fight him, you couldn't protect your bombers, your carriers, your fleet. The Japanese would own the sky, and whoever owned the sky won the war. But somewhere in those late nights, a different question emerged. What if the unit of combat wasn't the individual pilot, but the pair? What if two aircraft working together could create angles that neither could achieve alone? The geometry started to make sense. If a Zero pursued one Wildcat, turning to get behind it, the targeted pilot could turn toward his wingman. The wingman, seeing this, could turn toward the threatened pilot. Their paths would cross, scissoring through space, and the pursuing Zero would suddenly find itself flying through a firing solution it hadn't anticipated. The enemy pilot would have to break off or fly straight into the guns of the second Wildcat. Either way, the immediate threat was neutralized. Either way, the American pilots survived to engage again. Thatch called it the beam defense maneuver in his notes. Others would eventually call it the Thatch weave. On paper, it looked promising, but paper didn't shoot back. Paper didn't pull 9 Gs in a desperate turn. Paper didn't account for fear, confusion, and the chaos of combat at 300 miles per hour. When Thatch proposed the concept to senior officers, he encountered polite skepticism. Some acknowledged its theoretical elegance. Others pointed out that it required pilots to trust their wingmen completely, to fly toward each other at closing speeds that left almost no margin for error. Any mistake in timing, any hesitation, and you'd collide with your own element rather than kill the enemy. The Naval Bureau of Aeronautics had bigger priorities in late 1941: new aircraft programs, pilot training pipelines, industrial mobilization. A theoretical tactical concept from a squadron commander in San Diego didn't rise to the level of institutional attention. Thatch was told to document his ideas and submit them through proper channels. He did. The documents disappeared into bureaucratic filing systems. No one told him no, but no one told him yes either. December came, and then Pearl Harbor changed everything. The smoke was still rising from Battleship Row when the implications became clear to everyone. The Zero was real. The Japanese pilots were skilled, and American naval aviation would have to fight them with the aircraft and tactics currently available. Thatch's theoretical problem was now an operational emergency. His squadron, VF-3, was assigned to the carrier Lexington and then Yorktown as the Navy scrambled to respond to the cascading Japanese offensive across the Pacific. In the chaotic early months of 1942, American carrier pilots engaged Japanese aircraft in the scattered actions that punctuated the long retreats. The results confirmed everything Thatch had feared. Wildcats that tried to dogfight Zeros were shot down at sickening rates. Pilots who survived their first encounter often described a feeling of helplessness, of being outclassed by an aircraft and pilot combination that seemed to anticipate every move. Thatch redoubled his efforts to refine and teach the weave. He brought his pilots together and walked them through the concept with models, diagrams, and endless explanation. Two aircraft, separated by a specific distance, turning toward each other when threatened. The geometry created a defensive mutual support system that the Zero's advantages couldn't easily overcome. Some pilots understood immediately, others resisted. The weave required subordinating individual initiative to cooperative discipline. It meant trusting your wingman with your life in a way that felt unnatural. Fighter pilots were selected for aggression and confidence. They wanted to chase, to kill, to dominate. The weave asked them to wait, to coordinate, to let the geometry do the work. Thatch persisted. He flew practice engagements against his own pilots, playing the role of the superior enemy, watching them execute the weave in controlled conditions. When it worked beautifully. The scissoring motion created firing opportunities that individual combat couldn't generate. When it failed catastrophically. Mistimed turns led to near collisions. Hesitation allowed the simulated enemy to pick off isolated targets. He refined the distances, he adjusted the timing cues, he developed hand signals and radio procedures to coordinate the turns. Every failure taught him something. Every success built his confidence that the concept was sound. But the Navy's tactical doctrine remained unchanged. Official manuals still emphasized individual combat skills. Squadron training programs still focused on gunnery and aerobatics rather than coordinated defense. Thatch's weave existed as a local experiment taught to his pilots but unknown to the broader force. In April 1942, Lexington was preparing for operations in the Coral Sea when Thatch submitted another formal proposal to adopt the beam defense maneuver as standard fighter doctrine. He included data from his training exercises. He explained the geometry. He argued that American pilots were dying because they were fighting the wrong way. The response came back through channels. The concept was interesting but unproven in combat. Resources were focused on pilot production and aircraft delivery. Tactical innovation would have to wait. Thatch didn't wait. He continued drilling his pilots in every spare hour. He knew what was coming. The decisive battle for the Pacific would arrive soon, and his men would either fight with the tools he'd given them or fight with doctrine that had already failed. The question was no longer theoretical. It was whether the Navy would listen before it was too late. May 1942 brought the Battle of the Coral Sea, where American and Japanese carriers clashed in the first pure carrier engagement in history. Thatch's squadron missed the main action due to operational assignments, but the reports that filtered back were mixed. The Lexington was lost. Japanese expansion was blunted but not stopped, and American fighter pilots had again struggled against the Zero in the confused melees over the fleet. The stage was set for Midway. Intelligence officers had cracked enough Japanese codes to know the approximate timing and location of the next offensive. Admiral Nimitz gambled everything on an ambush, positioning his remaining carriers northeast of Midway to strike the Japanese fleet before it could complete its objectives. Thatch flew from Yorktown on the morning of June 4, 1942, leading 6 Wildcats as fighter escort for the torpedo bombers of VT-3. The mission was to locate and attack the Japanese carriers while they were still rearming and refueling their aircraft. The first hours were a navigation exercise across empty ocean. The pilots flew in formation, conserving fuel, watching their instruments, scanning the horizon for any sign of the enemy fleet. Radio silence meant isolation. Each cockpit was a small bubble of machinery, fuel fumes, and waiting. When they found the Japanese carriers, the tactical situation was already deteriorating. American air groups had become scattered during the approach. The carefully planned coordinated attack had fragmented into piecemeal strikes. Torpedo bombers from Hornet and Enterprise had already begun their runs, pressing toward the Japanese carriers without fighter escort, absorbing terrible losses from the swarms of Zeros defending the fleet. Thatch brought his Wildcats down to provide what protection he could for his own torpedo squadron. The sky was filled with burning aircraft, parachutes, and the crisscrossing trails of combat. Japanese Zeros were everywhere, aggressive, confident, hunting in pairs and divisions. What happened next would later be reconstructed from fragmentary pilot accounts and post-battle analysis. Thatch found himself separated from most of his flight, engaged by multiple Zeros that materialized out of the chaos. The Japanese pilots were skilled and persistent. They worked together, trying to isolate individual Wildcats for destruction. Thatch executed the weave. He and his remaining wingman began the coordinated turns he had practiced endlessly. When a Zero committed to pursuing one of them, they crossed toward each other, forcing the Japanese pilot to either break off or fly through the firing solution of the other Wildcat. The geometry worked. Zeros that had been pressing home attacks found themselves suddenly defensive, evading American gunfire from unexpected angles. The pursuing became the pursued, if only momentarily. The American pilots survived engagements that individual combat would have made fatal. In the swirling chaos above the Japanese fleet, Thatch's small group of Wildcats held their own against numerically superior and individually superior aircraft. They didn't destroy the Zero threat. They couldn't. But they survived, and in surviving, they proved something that doctrine said was impossible. The battle continued around them. American dive bombers found the Japanese carriers with their decks full of armed and fueled aircraft. In minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese fleet carriers were burning. The 4th would follow before the day ended. Thatch nursed his damaged, fuel-starved Wildcat back toward Yorktown. The carrier had been hit by Japanese bombers during the battle. Fires burned along her flight deck. Damage control parties fought to save her while aircraft orbited overhead, waiting for clearance to land. He touched down on a deck still covered with debris from the attack. His Wildcat was shot through. His wingman had taken hits but was alive. Other pilots from VF-3 had not returned, but the weave had worked. In combat against the best pilots and best aircraft Japan possessed, the coordinated defense had kept American fighters in the fight when individual tactics would have failed. The battle wasn't over. Yorktown would eventually sink from additional Japanese attacks. American losses were significant, but the Japanese carrier fleet was destroyed, and with it, the offensive capability that had swept across the Pacific for 6 months. In the after-action reports filed in the exhausted days following Midway, Thatch documented what his pilots had done. He described the weave in operational terms. He quantified the engagements. He argued again for doctrinal adoption. This time, people listened. The statistical analysis that followed Midway confirmed what Thatch had seen in combat. Fighter squadrons that employed the weave experienced dramatically better survival rates than those using traditional tactics. The kill ratios began to shift, not because the Wildcat had suddenly become superior to the Zero, but because American pilots had stopped fighting the wrong battle. Within weeks, the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics issued tactical bulletins incorporating the beam defense maneuver into standard fighter doctrine. Training commands received updated materials. Newly commissioned pilots learned the weave alongside basic formation, flying, and gunnery. Thatch was pulled from combat operations to help systematize the training. He traveled to squadrons preparing for deployment, demonstrating the technique, explaining the geometry, answering the skeptical questions he'd heard dozens of times before. The same doubts emerged. It requires too much trust. It's too dangerous to cross that. Close, you're asking pilots to fly toward each other in combat. He answered each objection with the evidence from Midway. The pilots who had flown the Weave were alive. Many of those who hadn't were dead. The mathematics was brutal, but undeniable. Throughout the remainder of 1942 and into 1943, the Weave spread through the Navy's fighter community. Pilots in the Solomon Islands employed it against Zero attacks on Henderson Field. Carrier squadrons covering the Guadalcanal campaign used it to protect their dive bombers and torpedo planes. The technique evolved as different squadrons added variations suited to their particular circumstances. The results accumulated in combat reports from across the Pacific. Wildcat pilots, who had once felt helpless against the Zero, began achieving tactical draws, then advantages, then victories. The aircraft hadn't changed. The pilots hadn't suddenly become more skilled. But the system they operated within had transformed their individual capabilities into collective effectiveness. Marine Corps squadrons adopted the Weave at Guadalcanal, where fighter defense of the contested airfield became the margin between holding the island and losing it. Pilots like Joe Foss and Marion Carl fought using the coordinated tactics Thatch had developed, achieving scores that would have been impossible with previous doctrine. When the F-6F Hellcat entered service in 1943, American fighters finally had an aircraft that could match the Zero in most performance categories. The Hellcat was faster, could dive better, and retained the durability that kept American pilots alive. Combined with the tactical framework the Weave represented, it shifted the balance permanently. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot in June 1944 demonstrated the ultimate expression of what Thach had started. American fighters, flying coordinated defensive and offensive tactics, destroyed over 300 Japanese aircraft in a single day while losing only 29 of their own. The kill ratio had inverted completely. Japanese naval aviation never recovered. The pilots lost at Midway had been the irreplaceable core of their carrier force. Those who survived were progressively overwhelmed by American pilots who fought smarter, in better aircraft, with doctrine designed to maximize collective advantage. Thatch himself spent much of the war training others, a role that frustrated him even as he recognized its necessity. He wanted to be in combat. Instead, he was in classrooms and ready rooms, teaching the technique to men who would fight the battles he'd prepared them for. The data vindicated everything: survival rates, kill ratios, mission completion statistics. All pointed to the same conclusion. A tactical innovation developed by one thoughtful officer had multiplied the effectiveness of an entire force. John Thatch returned to combat in the war's final year, commanding the escort carrier USS Sicily and later serving on the staff of Admiral John McCain. He saw the destruction of Japanese air power firsthand, the burning hulks of enemy carriers, the diminished skill of replacement pilots sent against Americans who had spent 3 years refining their advantages. The war ended in September 1945 with Japanese surrender aboard USS Missouri. Thatch was there, watching the ceremony that concluded the conflict his work had helped win. He was 40 years old, a captain, a father, a husband, a man who had spent 4 years immersed in the organized violence of carrier warfare. In the years that followed, he rose to 4-star admiral, commanding fleets and shaping naval policy through the early Cold War. The Weave remained standard doctrine, adapted for jet aircraft and new threat environments, but fundamentally unchanged in its core insight. Coordinated defense multiplies individual capability against superior opponents. He retired in 1967 after 37 years of service. The Navy he left behind was nuclear-powered and missile-armed, but its fighter pilots still trained in formations that descended directly from his kitchen table experiments with matchsticks. Thatch lived until 1981, long enough to see a new generation of naval aviators fly combat missions over Vietnam using tactical principles he had pioneered. He gave interviews occasionally, always modest about his contribution, always redirecting credit to the pilots who had executed the maneuvers under fire. When asked about that morning over Midway, about the moment when theory became practice and survival hung on split-second coordination, he described it with characteristic precision. The zeros had been everywhere. His pilots had done what they'd trained to do. The geometry had worked. He never claimed to have won the battle. He knew the dive bomber pilots who destroyed the Japanese carriers had delivered the decisive blow. But he also knew that fighter doctrine in 1942 had been inadequate for the threat, and that he had found a solution when conventional wisdom said none existed. The lesson he carried from that experience was simple but profound. Superior equipment was valuable but not sufficient. Individual skill mattered but wasn't enough. What made the difference was systematic thinking about how to maximize human and material resources within the constraints actually faced. He had watched pilots die because they fought the way they'd been taught rather than the way the situation demanded. He had refused to accept that doctrine as inevitable, and in refusing, he had found something that saved lives and helped win a war. In naval aviation schools today, instructors still teach the Thatch weave. They explain the geometry, demonstrate the timing, drill the coordination until it becomes instinct. Most of the young pilots have never heard of the man who created it. They don't know about the kitchen table or the dismissed proposals or the moment over Midway when matchstick theory became aerial reality. But every time two fighters cross toward each other, scissors through hostile space, trusting each other with their lives, they execute something born from one officer's refusal to accept that a problem was unsolvable. The Pacific swallowed many secrets during those war years. Ships and aircraft and men vanished into depths that kept no records. But some things survived. Some ideas proved durable enough to outlast the conflict that demanded them. John Thatch gave his pilots a way to fight when fighting seemed hopeless. He gave them a system that turned individual vulnerability into collective strength. He gave them a chance. Sometimes that's enough to change everything.